Just heard recordings in progress. Excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction, and congratulations, Kerry. That was awesome. Well done. So I believe I've got 45 minutes. I'm actually going to put my timer on because I do get on a bit of a roll with this stuff, and before you know it, 2 hours are done. So I've just got my timer on there, just to stop Scott being anxious, maybe. So look. It's what, 7 o'clock there, 7:15 or something. It's just after 5 a.m. here, and so this may well get better as we go along. The coffee is starting to go in, and hopefully it'll make sense as we go through. I don't have a lot of time, 45 minutes, then some questions. So just quickly, a little bit of an introduction just to set the context of why I'm talking about what I'm talking about today. And so I am a psychologist, but my background is actually clinical psychology rather than organizational psychology. And 20 odd years ago, I've always been in senior leadership roles, but safety just wasn't a thing for me. I was working back then specializing in the addictions, treating the addictions, that is. And I was the clinical director of the Gold Coast Drug Council, which is a huge rehab over here. And look, this is just the nature of addiction. From time to time, as the senior leader of that organization, I needed to sit down with a mum and or a dad and explain to them that their son or daughter was never coming home again because they passed away from a drug-related problem like overdose and so forth. So obviously incredibly difficult conversations. And for the overflow, I actually started a private practice specializing in grief counseling. And it was interesting, as soon as I did that, my phone started ringing a lot from EAP providers, Employment Assistance Program. And what they wanted me to do, for example, was to go to a mine site or a construction site or an oil and gas plant after a fatality on site. So this was my first exposure to health and safety in high-risk industries. And what shocked me was the fact that I was out there doing that every week. In other words, how frequently these events occurred. That was news to me. Australia has a relatively small population, but about 200 people a year die of a workplace incident here. You can multiply that number by 7 for the amount of people permanently disabled, that is perhaps in a wheelchair for the rest of their lives and so forth. So that did shock me. And again, that's challenging work. I was out there counseling family members, team members, leadership teams after a fatality on site. And so for me, it was interesting as I was doing, if you will, all that humanistic work, counseling, the companies were sending out their press releases, and it seemed to me the same lawyers wrote them all. Words to the effect of, we wish to reassure people that our people's safety is our highest priority. And frankly, from where I was sitting, it didn't really seem that way. As they were doing that, though, what they were also doing were things like investigations, audits, looking for violations and offenders and breaches of golden rules. And as a clinician, I couldn't help thinking, wow, where else in the organization do we use that language? But we use it in safety. And look, after doing week after week, well, months and effectively years of that work, I was pretty desperate to see what we could start doing at the other end. That is, what can we do to prevent fatalities? And the more I looked at these organizations, global mining companies, very sophisticated companies, for me at least at that time, very little of what they were doing in health and safety appeared to be based on any evidence or research. It just seemed like they were doing what everybody else was doing. Again, the maybe harsh language on my part, but the safety platitudes were all there. Yeah, safety is our #1 priority, and our goal is zero harm, for example. But at the same time, that language was there. Violators, offenders, and just the language they used for their people, safety officers, compliance officers, doing these. I mean, who doesn't love being investigated by an officer, huh? And to me, there was little surprise then that the workforce themselves used to view the hardworking safety people as the fun police, you know, as the safety cops. That was no surprise to me. You can't not get that when you use that type of language. And language is important. Words are powerful. Words are not neutral. And so for me as a clinician, but also somebody who's been in senior leadership roles all my career, it was, all right, this is not evidence-based. And so for me, it was a mission then, because I didn't want to keep having those post-fatality conversations. I wanted something different. So I started putting the research together, and we put pilot programs together and started rolling it out to some very brave early adopters here in Australia. And it sort of really took off. Now, this culminated about 10 years ago with what is now called the Care Factor program. And please understand, it is not about running around giving people hugs or anything. I'll get to why we call it that. It's an evidence-based program. But yeah, for the rest of my career, I've been doing that, helping organizations to understand the evidence base behind that, what actually works, in other words. Now, because I don't have long, because I wrote a whole book about this stuff, I thought, I'm just going to present 5 ideas, that's all. There's a wonderful psychological study, many of you would know, I'm sure. And that is, the study was called The Magic Number 7 ± 2 by a very, very famous psychologist called George Miller. And what that means is all we can hold in our short-term memory, that is our conscious mind at any time, is between 5 and 9 chunks of information. And so I'm going to err on the side of the 5 here, because, you know, it's getting on in the evening, you might have had a glass of wine. And I thought, if I can just give you 5 key ideas, and my suggestion would be also to maybe print these 5 ideas out, put them in your work area somewhere, and just before you say, go and have potentially a difficult conversation, before you do a safety walk, I'd like to talk about those too, before you do an incident investigation, for example, maybe just flick through these 5 ideas. And I really think just doing that regularly can really help you to, I don't know, just do these things better, essentially. So look, I'm going to get straight into this. Excuse me, I've just got to find out, how can I just adjust my slides here? No, that's not moving for some reason. Let's have a look. There we go. All right, so what I'll do up here, just very quickly, put these 5 ideas up, and then just a little bit more data about each of the 5 ideas as we move through. So here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'll just read through them, but I won't say too much at this point because we'll come back to them. I'll claim a few of these, but those of you in the safety field, of course, would recognize maybe at least one of these from Todd Conklin. And if anybody has not read Todd Conklin's work, I thoroughly recommend it. The classic book from Todd for me would be Pre-Accident Investigations. And number 3 there, we can blame or we can learn. We can't do both. At least the first person I heard say that was Todd Conklin. A quote from my book up there, Trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. We'll talk about that. Another of my chapter headings, Behaviors are not the problem. Behaviors are expressions of the problem. As I said, we can blame or we can learn. Number 4, one I've been talking a lot about lately, we can't fix a secret. As leaders, we can fix a lot of things. We simply cannot fix a secret. And number 5, another topical theme of late, and that is a policy can't make it safe to speak up. So those are the 5 key ideas. And again, for me, once we understand a little bit behind these concepts and we use these regularly, I think that alone can help shape the direction we take safety to. So look, just to get us kicked off, whenever we're running the Care Factor program, my first question to leaders is that one. Understanding that mostly I work with high hazard, so mining, oil and gas, construction, utilities, and so forth. Generally speaking, of course, they will have lots of safety policies and procedures, usually way too many, but that's a whole other talk. They have good safety management systems, they've got PPE, they've got all that stuff. And yet, as they also know, they still have incidents. So my question is, well, why? Why is that? Given that we've got all this stuff in place, why do we still have incidents? Now, these are by far the most frequent responses I get from leaders to that question, things like this. Well, look, they take risks. They don't follow procedures. They take shortcuts. They get distracted. They don't speak up. So what's the common denominator here? Well, they. And in this context, of course, who are they? Well, they are the workforce. And so please understand, we can blame or we can learn. I don't intend to be blaming leaders here. Again, I extend that same quote to leaders. We can blame or we can learn. Let's learn. This is a natural reaction. We have energy-saving brains, especially under stress. We want to go the path of least resistance. And often, by the way, an incident looks like one of those. Hey, somebody took a shortcut. Somebody didn't follow a procedure. It looks like that. A supervisor recently in a leaders group, I asked this same question, and his immediate response was, why do they have incidents? Because they're bloody stupid. And for me, it's, well, hang on. I understand it can look like that, but if that is the depth of our analysis, right? If that is as far as we're going with the analysis, all we're ever going to really do is wait for the next allegedly stupid person to do exactly the same thing. There's no learning in that. There's no growth in that. And the danger here with the they do this, they do that, is that it's essentially a blame-based approach. What we end up doing, of course, is creating fear amongst the workforce. Where there's blame, you get fear. Where there's fear, you lower trust. And I'll be talking about the significance of lower trust as we move through. For me, the bottom line, I like to remind leaders up first up, is that all of the above, all of those are to some degree influenced by culture and by leadership. Well, why don't people speak up? Well, maybe that's the last time somebody did. And I've got a great example of this recently on a coal mine. One of the contractors on that coal mine stopped the job for a legitimate safety concern. The following week, not just that one guy, but the whole contracting company he worked for were gone. Okay, do that once and word soon gets around. Who's going to speak up now, right? We get distracted. Yeah, we do. Sometimes we get distracted by things that aren't even at work. You know, we get distracted by a fight with my partner before I left for work, a sick child and so forth. And what we know is we can't really stop that happening. But if we've got the sort of culture where people pick up on that, they pick up that somebody's not quite themselves, and they immediately watch their mates, they have the conversations they need, we can actually offset at least some of that distraction. Of course, there's plenty of things that distract us at work sometimes, such as the leadership team doing their safety walk. I'll come back to that shortly. I've got a great common example. People take shortcuts. Well, again, why? Why does it make sense to take a shortcut? Maybe that's the time pressure that I'm experiencing and so forth. Don't follow procedures. Well, maybe the procedure doesn't fit a lot of the time. Maybe it fits 90% of the time, but not when it's raining, for example. Again, unless we actually move away from just instant blame and a focus on people's behaviors, then we can't really learn. We're going to be a blaming organization, not a learning organization. So I'll come back to that shortly. Now, in my book, for those of you that have read my book, would remember that model. And no doubt the safety people in the room would recognize at least the bones of that, that model as very, very similar to Professor Patrick Hudson's level of safety, culture, maturity. You'll notice the heading there says cultural maturity. I don't even say safety here. Even though I just wrote a book about safety culture, I don't actually really buy into the whole safety culture thing. I buy into culture, but I think if you've got a great culture, you're doing pretty well safety-wise as a rule, but that's just my thinking. What I did in the book was just bring some of the current research to bear. As I say in the book, all models are wrong, but some are useful, which is a lovely quote from George Box. This probably falls into that category. It's not the right model, but I found it incredibly useful working with organizations so they can understand sort of where they currently sit and what it might look like if they were to actually progress in maturity or indeed go backwards sometimes. So just very briefly, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff I want to get to. Those, if you will, those less mature climates, the apathetic, the reactive, exactly what I've just been talking about. They tend to see incidents as purely the fault of the workforce because they do stupid things, because they don't follow procedures and so forth. So it's a very blame-based approach. Now, of course, once you do that, you end up with us versus them, not just us and them, us versus them. The workforce will tend to keep secrets from management. And as we'll get to in a little while, we can't fix a secret. You cannot fix things you don't know about. Now, of course, there's a very good reason they're keeping secrets, and that is if they were to divulge what they see as the truth, they probably have got some evidence somewhere that somebody's going to cop it as a result. So what you get is high levels of fear, and the correlation there is low levels of trust. And where you get high fear and low trust, people simply don't speak up. They just won't do that. Now, conversely, up in the proactive, the integrated, where I guess the high reliability organizations sit, nuclear, aviation, increasingly healthcare. It looks very different. Us versus them tends to be replaced by we. Leaders recognize that incidents occur because of all manner of reasons, including management decisions, including that. There's an increasing flow of authentic information. Now, when Hudson talked about this, he spoke about the importance of a well-informed workplace. That is true. That is really important. What he didn't state, though, that I think is probably more valuable, is we need as leaders to be well-informed by the workforce. And that, of course, infers that we get out there and we engage in what I would call humble inquiry, the effective use of questions. So, guys, what is it you need to do your job well and reliably? Tell us about the new policy. Where does it fit? Where does it not fit? So in the more mature cultures, you have this two-way flow of authentic information, not cloaked, not disguised, not hidden, no game playing, but authentic information. Now that bottom arrow, of course, talks about increasing levels of trust, therefore fear. And I do have the term there, psychological safety. And if you haven't really got into that concept yet, I just tend to view that as trust when it's experienced at the team level. In other words, everybody in my team knows it is safe for them to share ideas. So this is about innovation as well, to admit mistakes. And that can take a bit of doing in some cultures, to report near misses and so forth. Now, when you've got everybody doing that, you're more of a learning team than you are, if you like, a blaming team. Let me just say this too, and I've learned this the hard way myself. Many companies seek to change their organizational culture by focusing on the overall organizational culture. And for me, that is fraught and incredibly challenging. Generally speaking, cultures are too big, too old, too unwieldy, too intangible to address all at once. The way I tend to view this, as I put in the book, cultures tend to change one team at a time. That is, one leader, his, her, their team, one conversation at a time often. But when you get that one leader actually making these changes that we're going to describe, and that leader has created psychological safety within their team, well, they at least can progress on that maturity scale. Now, when many leaders are doing that, many teams move, it's almost the byproduct of that is organizational culture change. But don't make the mistake of trying to change the culture. It's usually too big. I am going to progress. I usually throw this question out there too, and that is, well, organizational culture, do we have one or many? And for me, based on what I've just said, organizations don't have one culture anyway. They have many cultures. I believe every team has its own culture. There may well be overlap, but every team has its own culture. And look, in a moment of narcissism, I included here a quote from my book. It just seemed to fit, so I just put it in. But it's true, I've worked globally with global companies. And here in Australia, say with companies like Rio Tinto or BHP, they've got sites all around the country. And they have, of course, the same set of organizational values. They have the same safety policies, procedures, safety management systems. They all use the same PPE. So everything is the same there. But what I also know is one of their sites could be operating down at that reactive level, for example, whereas another one might be up at the proactive level. Everything else is the same. So what's usually the biggest factor of difference? Well, it generally comes down to leadership. And some leaders have been able to create the climate where trust and psychological safety can thrive, whereas others simply haven't. And again, if you think I'm blaming leaders here, just hold your fire. I don't blame leaders for that. It's often that, and here in Australia, for example, I'll give you a classic example, underground mining. And I've been working around underground mines now for 20 odd years. And it's almost like their leaders, their frontline leaders are taught that the way you lead your people is, what I'd call the very macho pointy finger approach. You do this, do that. And the inference is if you don't, somebody's going to get their butt kicked. It's all about the punishment mentality. They were taught to lead in those ways. And what's interesting here is when we have a mining boom on, which we currently have another one of, often mining companies need to bring frontline leaders up very quickly. So what they'll do is promote from within. That is, they'll bring somebody up from the crew level and put them in a supervisor role. Now, when you think about the criteria they use to select these people, it's usually not because of their people skills, huh? It's usually because they were really good operators. They were really good on the tools and so forth. And then I think often they just expect that magically, now we've made you a supervisor, you will now be able to run a really good toolbox talk or start a shift meeting, really bring your guys on and engage them and so, and frankly, many of them can't. And that is not their fault. The very least we can do as senior leaders is to give them the skills they need, the abilities they need to be able to do those things. And we'll touch on that. So look, idea number one is that trust arrives on foot but leaves on horseback. Apparently a Dutch proverb. I love it. And I think intuitively people will understand the meaning from our own lives, right? Even outside of work. We all know this from our own lives. It can be quite challenging at work to create trust, especially if you've just inherited, say, a team who had a bit of a, I don't know, a micromanager previously, or there's been a lot of turnover amongst leaders. It might be difficult then to regain or to build that trust in the first place. So trust arrives on foot. It can be slow. But I think as we've all experienced, man, we can wreck it really fast. Just one conversation gone awry, one pointed finger too many, one occasion where I didn't follow through and said what I said I was going to do. Trust does evaporate quite quickly. Now, I want to assure people, and those of you who have read my book would know this, I don't talk about things like trust, benevolence, care, because they're nice, okay? They may well be nice. They probably are nice, but that's not why I talk about them. This is evidence-based. And when I was doing my own research, I am yet to find a more consistent predictor of safety culture and safety performance than trust. And I've put that out there many times and nobody has actually responded to that yet. Incidentally, this is not just about safety. Those of you familiar with Project Aristotle and the work of Professor Amy Edmondson would know that psychological safety is the #1 predictor of high-performing teams. So we're not talking about stuff here because it's nice. It's really important stuff. And I'm pleased to say that Australia is quite up there in terms of leading the research here. Figures like Sydney Decker, David Proven, and so forth. This is one of the concluding paragraphs of a study that was done in Australia through ANU, Australian National University. And to me, it's a big one. It's huge. And that is, I'll just read through it briefly, but it's there. Unless the mistrust of the workforce can be overcome, even the most well-intentioned and sophisticated management initiatives will be treated with cynicism and undermined. Now, what is that really saying? Essentially, and I still see this on a monthly basis, by the way, what it means is it doesn't really matter what you do, what you roll out, what your current safety initiatives are, unless we have first, to a strong degree, overcome any existing mistrust, people will actively, not passively, but actively undermine it, and there will be cynicism. And when I see this, I see this regularly. Let me give you an example. Is a company, say, has a huge spike in incidents, a huge spike in injuries. By the way, when you get a big spike in injuries, almost always that is cultural. It's not bad luck, it's nothing. A big spike is usually cultural. When that happens, often what companies over here will do, for example, is they'll kind of, as I said before, they'll do what everybody else does. All right, we'll phone DuPont, yeah? Or we'll bring in a shiny new behavior-based safety program, which is incidentally an oxymoron. There's nothing shiny and new about behaviorism. And I'll get to that point shortly. And they just roll this program out. And as they wheel the reluctant workforce in to go through their new training, the workforce are sitting there with folded arms. And what they're thinking is, here we go again. Management's latest attempt to fix us, because clearly we are the problem here. And just quietly, there's a middle finger going up and they will actively seek to undermine it. All I'm saying here is, before you do anything like that, because companies will blow $5 million on that rollout, and they've just literally blown their dough. First, move to trust. First, seek to overcome mistrust. And essentially, that's why we talk about what we talk about and why we do what we do. And I'll touch on a bit more of that as we go through. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, Scott. Don't panic, my friend. We're doing all right. All right. Idea number 2, straight from my book. And this, to me, goes way back to my clinical days. But when I started working in safety, it's exactly the same. We tend to focus on people's behaviors. As I mentioned before, they take shortcuts, they do this. And for my money, it's not the behaviors per se that are the problem. Behaviors can point to systemic issues. They can point to things that are not okay, but that's how we need to look at them. Behaviors are expressions of the problem. The behaviors themselves will never clear up. They'll never stop until we actually find out and we realize why those behaviors exist. This is to do with sense making, and that is a whole area of study I recommend to safety practitioners. Why did that behavior make sense to that person? If you can understand why it makes sense, we can actually learn from that. If you're just dismissing that as somebody who operated stupidly, there is no learning. You simply cannot learn by that. Now, in my book, and again, in the work that we do, we talk a lot about self-fulfilling prophecies. And again, this is a cognitive psychology approach. And we all have these, by the way. A prophecy is something that will come true. Self-fulfilling means we make it happen. And we usually make it happen through our fundamental assumptions. And then it just follows through. This is a very common self-fulfilling prophecy, especially down in those apathetic and reactive cultures. And again, it all kicks off with this notion that fundamentally people are the problem. That's why we have incidents, because they take shortcuts. Now, if that is our fundamental assumption, it's difficult not to focus on their behavior. It's almost bound to happen. And of course, when we focus on the behavior primarily, and we do safety walks to do this, don't we? What are we looking for on safety walks? They should actually be called unsafety walks generally here in Australia, because that's what we're looking for. All right, let's call them what it is. Let's do an unsafety walk and get out there with the high-vis jacket, the hard hat, pen and pad, put the fear of God into people and as we watch them do bad stuff, and then take a photo of it. Man, that's going to create a lot of trust, huh? And I'll come back to that point shortly. So we focus on the behavior. Now that when they're good, and listen to the language, when they're good, what are they, kids? We might give them a reward. If they've gone, I don't know, 60 days without a lost time injury, I tell you what, let's have a barbecue. Yeah, let's celebrate. We'll give you some trinkets. How about a cap, keyring, backpack, and so forth. Every day, it seems, on LinkedIn. And for those of you on this call, please, if you're on LinkedIn, feel free to connect. I do publish a lot, almost neurotically, because I'm really passionate about this stuff. But I often see on LinkedIn, 1 million hours LTI free. Congratulations, having barbecues, backpacks, and keyrings. And the cynic in me just can't help but wonder, was it actually 1 million hours LTI free? Or was it 1 million hours reporting free? And I know sometimes it's the latter. I've had occasions where that 1 million hours is fast approaching and people buy the trinkets. They got 1,000 caps, 1,000 key rings and a huge barbecue. And then they have an incident before the due date. What do? Shh, let's just have the celebration first. And at the same time, they're telling people safety is the highest priority and so forth. So this focus on behavior, when they're bad though, we'll punish them. Just like the example I gave, we'll do the incident investigation, somebody's going to cop it. And this approach, of course, almost invariably comes back to the worker. This is where, unfortunately, things like micromanagement can feed this fear loop. Behavior-based safety can actually feed this. And even with the best of intent, and I've seen some companies do it well, but when we talk about behavior-based safety, whose behavior are we talking about? We're not talking about the behavior of the boardroom or the executive team or supervisors. We're talking about the behavior of the workforce. So even with the best of intent, it comes back to a blame the worker approach, what Phil LeDuc once called blame-based safety. That's what it tends to be. So this focus on reward or punishment, because seriously, If behaviorism worked, no self-respecting psychologist, by the way, has used behaviorism since the 1950s, unless we're training our dogs. You know, it's quite effective then. But this focus, if leadership was that simple, all leaders would need is a big stick and a bunch of carrots. It's not that simple. People are way more complex than that. Of course, what this leads to is the reward or punishment mentality. That's what behaviorism is. And in doing so, what we create is fear and extrinsic motivation, even for the good stuff. And of course, what we do ultimately is we inhibit learning because we inhibit speaking up. We cannot learn if people are not speaking up. Now, a reminder that those apathetic and reactive cultures, they hurt way more people. And when they continue to hurt way more people, well, what do we put that down to? Well, that's because people are the problem, right? There's your self-fulfilling prophecy. That just goes round and round and round, becomes embedded in culture. And it's dreadfully common still. We need to move out of that. And we'll talk about how we do that very shortly. So idea number 3, to me, that phrasing came from Todd Conklin, but I think other people have said similar things, but it's a really big one. We can blame or we can learn. We can't do both. And for my money, especially in safety, it's essentially that fear loop. The more we blame, the less likely it is that people will speak up in the future. And if people don't speak up, obviously we can't learn from it. So here's the other type of self-fulfilling prophecy. This is more common in, say, the proactive cultures, possibly the integrated cultures. And again, it starts with a fundamental assumption, but a very different one, a much more conscious one. And that is quite simply that people are the solution. Understanding, like us, we've got limitations with our conscious mind. We can only hold between 5 and 9 things up here. We get distracted. We all do. That's just human nature. Incidentally, just on human nature, complacency is human nature. Our brain is literally wired to save energy. And you would all know this from your driving. The more we do something, the more it becomes a network of connections in our brain, the more likely it is that we'll actually operate on autopilot, unconsciously, if you like. I reckon everybody on this Zoom call that drives would have had this experience, right? Where you get in your car, you drive from A to B, you get to your destination, and you think, gee, I don't remember anything on that drive, because you drove on auto. We all do this. I had, again, a global oil and gas company phone me up the other day, and they said, Clive, we want you to roll the Care Factor program out for the crews. And I said, what about your leaders? No, mate, they're fine, eh? It's just the crews. They're really complacent. Used as an insult, effectively, they've become really complacent. And look, I'm a bit of a straight shooter with this stuff, only because I've attended so many fatalities. I have no time for sort of silliness. And I did explain that you can't really blame people for complacency. That's just how our brains are wired. So take the blame out of that. We need to understand it. And we need to do whatever we can to offset that. But you're never going to do that by blaming people for that. So people are the solution means that we get all that. Yet why are people are the solution, or at least part of the solution, is they're on the front line day in, day out. They understand the tasks, the work, way better than we do. They know the nuances. They know, where this policy actually works really well and under what circumstances it doesn't. We don't necessarily get that. And so when that is our fundamental assumption, the behaviors that flow from us towards our people changes quite dramatically. Instead of focusing on their behavior, we're actually just more curious. Let's tap into that. If they're the solution, let's tap into it. We call this inquiry. A wonderful book. I'm going to recommend a bunch of books here for the readers. A wonderful book by Ed Shine called Humble Inquiry. Not a long book. It's a bit like mine. It's short and snappy, but it's just gold. And that book is all about asking effective questions. And that's when the leaders actually get out there. And instead of doing a safety walk, as it were, they just go for a walk. And while they're walking, they'll just stop and chat. And they might then ask a question like, well, what is it you need from us to do your job well and safely? And look, I'm a pretty simple guy. The way I've learned to frame safety over the years is when we consistently do work well and reliably. To me, that's just the essence of safety. Is when we do work well and reliably. You'll only really do that consistently when you've tapped into the wisdom of the crowd, when you've actually gone out there and asked people what they need. Now, of course, as we're out there doing that, asking the crew questions, and they learn that they can actually answer authentically and not get their butt kicked. What we're doing is also creating trust and relationships. We also get, of course, a lot more learning from this. We're no longer a blaming team, we're a learning team. When my whole team has finally realized that it is safe to share their thoughts, their ideas, their mistakes, we end up with, again, that high psychological safety and this intrinsic culture of people speaking up. Now, don't forget, these proactive and integrated cultures, they have way less than their fair share of incidents. And when that continues to happen, what do we put that down to? Well, that's because our people are the solution, hey? There's your self-fulfilling prophecy. That also ends up totally embedded in culture. And again, that's a classic self-fulfilling prophecy, very common in the proactive and integrated cultures. Now, very importantly, at the bottom of that model, I've just put the text up, work as imagined versus work as done. That's a concept I'm sure many of the HSC people in the room or in the various rooms would be very familiar with. And I'd recommend checking out work by the likes of my friend David Proven, who's done a lot of great work in this area. But this is a really interesting and important concept. And that is, I think as leaders, we often imagine when we wrote that safety policy, when we diligently researched this policy and wrote it, or possibly just cut and pasted it off the internet sometimes, we imagine then, once we've then mandated that to the workforce, that's how you do the job, we imagine that's how the work will be done based on that. And I'm sure you all realize that's actually not the case. There's invariably a gap between how work is done as we imagine it and work actually is done by the crews. Now, there's numerous reasons for that. It might simply be that the crew find quicker, easier, more expedient, and frankly, better ways to do it. It might be that we're complacent, we take shortcuts and all of those things, but there's almost always a gap. Now, think about this. If there's a gap between work as imagined and work as done, we don't know about that possibly. We can't risk manage that. We're just hoping the crews are. But the trouble is we don't know about it. Now, if I momentarily flick back to the fear loop there, think about that. There will be a gap between work as imagined and work as done. But how are you going to know about that? And the answer is you're not, because they're not going to tell you. How's that policy going, guys? Oh, fine. We just, yep, absolutely. That's how we're doing our work. Good to hear. You will hear about it ultimately, but you'll tend to hear about it ultimately when there's an incident. And then what do? We blame people for not following the policy. Now, with the trust loop, with this self-fulfilling prophecy, gaps will emerge. Of course they will, but we will hear about them as they emerge because they will come and let us know. And this new policy, look, it works great 99% of the time. When it's raining, it's no good at all, for example. We need to revisit it and so forth. So that work as imagined, work as done, it's a huge concept. You will only be able to close that gap once you have that trust loop operating, as it were. So we're up to idea number 4, and I'm just having a quick time check. Yeah, I'm doing fine. And look, this is a simple one. I don't think I need to labor this because we've already spoken about it. We can't fix a secret, but I do want to give you a couple of quick case studies that really, this is why I've been talking about it a lot. I think it was October last year was, I think this is only Australia, it was National Safe Work Month. And that's often when companies really get going with their safety initiatives, right? Our phone just rings red hot. Clive, what are you doing in October? Because it's Safe Month. We want to put a couple of webinars on. And, I'm kind of reluctant to get involved, frankly. What about all the other months? Anyway, a global mining company and I can actually name this company. It's safe to do that because their CEO very recently, and I did post this on LinkedIn, their CEO, I think courageously, put a big mea culpa forward. But what kind of led up to that, and I can't help but feel partially responsible, was I got a phone call from Newcrest's executive level safety team in October saying, Clive, we've got a new policy. What we're wanting to do is have psychological safety, right? And it's now a policy that people have to speak up. And I had a little talk about what psychological safety actually is and what it's not. But they said, yeah, we really want to push this psychological safety stuff. Can you do a webinar for us on it? Not sure. I was working from home because of COVID anyway, and we arranged to do that. So it's a day now before the webinar. And their executive safety leader actually phoned and said, Clive, before you do the webinar tomorrow, could you please just go through the content with me? Now, this is pretty rare. All right, people usually hire me because they kind of know what I'm about and so forth. But this wasn't the case with this executive leader. So I did, just as I'm doing with you now. I just sort of walked through the basic concepts. And there was this sort of real pregnant pause. And then the leader said, I'm wondering, Clive, if you can couch your language a little bit. I'm not known for that. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when you said behaviors are not the problem, behaviors are expressions of the problem, can you not say that? I said, well, no, that's kind of what I talk about. But what is your concern? My clinician came out. Tell me your concern. I said, frankly, I'm concerned that if you say that, I'll get fired. And I think the irony might have been lost, but the company wanted a webinar on psychological safety. And at the very same time, she's trying to actually say, you can't say any of that. Again, so that had to remain a secret. They can't do anything about that. And what I discovered very quickly at Newcrest was the terror, not fear, the terror level was through the roof, to the point where the executive level safety person thought, if they hire me, and I just say, in my belief, behaviors are not the problem, they are expressions of the problem, she could get fired. So again, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you might have seen the piece I put up, the mea culpa from the CEO, who discovered that turnover was through the roof. Morale was at an all-time low. People were off on stress leave, through the roof. And he said, it's because we've been micromanaging our people. We've created a toxic culture of fear. And I picked that up in the first 15 minutes of that conversation. We can't fix a secret. We really can't. It's tempting sometimes because we don't like bad news. I get that, but yeah, you got to watch that stuff. And that's why I've been talking about this one. A policy cannot make it safe to speak up. Let's have a policy that everybody has to speak up. I was working with a GM the other day. I was in his office all day. And he said at the beginning of the day, Clive, while you're in my office, you'll notice I do leave the door open. And that's because I have an open door policy. And for that whole day, nobody walked in. And for me, it's, even an open door policy, it's worth nothing if people are too frightened to walk through it, It just doesn't make sense. Other policies are, essentially what they're saying is, if you witness an incident, you must speak up. That's our policy. In fact, some people have a golden rule of disclosure. It's a policy. Well, it doesn't matter what the policy is. If people are too afraid to actually speak up, the policy is not worth a cent. You're better off forgetting about the policy and actually putting all of your conscious attention as a leader on making it safe to do the thing you want to do. I probably don't need to labor this one, but again, for those of you to who psychological safety is a relatively new concept, it's actually not. It's been around for decades, but I think it gained a lot of exposure when Amy Edmondson released that wonderful book. If you haven't read it, here's another book tip. If you haven't read it yet, I think all leaders should do so. It's not a safety book per se, it's just a great leadership book. And it's called The Fearless Organization, a must read. This is a quote, a direct quote from that book, and I just love it. Don't need to go through the whole thing. But again, what Amy Edmondson was saying is, where we have high psychological safety, the whole team The climate of the whole team is such that they feel comfortable sharing concerns and mistakes without any fear of embarrassment or retribution. They know they can speak up, won't be humiliated, ignored, blamed, and so forth. They tend to trust and respect their colleagues. Now, I wrote about this in my book, and Edmondson says the same thing, really. She's found the same thing, that psych safety is actually leader dependent. And what we know by that is some leaders have indeed been able to create the climate where psychological safety can thrive, and others had not. And again, I'm not blaming the leaders here. There are reasons for this. We can blame or we can learn. So, how come? Well, in the book in my book, and those of you who would read the book, you have seen this model. And this is a research-based model, an evidence-based model. I think we all understand trust intuitively, but the research is very, very clear about this. And it has been for a little while now, that the best way a leader can create psychological safety or trust within their team is by consistently demonstrating these three key factors. And probably no surprise with the first one, integrity. That is doing what we said we would do. Reliability, honesty are sort of implied there, if you like. That's, I think, intuitive to most people. Not all of this, though, is about what people might call people skills, or even worse, soft skills. There's nothing soft about them. Soft skills are actually pretty hard, I reckon. But this is partly about ability or competence. And that is, leaders do need to demonstrate that they're good at what they need to be good at. It doesn't mean we have to be good at everything, but our team do need to know that as a leader, I'm good at what I'm supposed to be good at. That is really quite important. Now, the third factor is what the academics call benevolence. How many syllables is that? 4 syllables. Bloody academics, eh? Why use one syllable when you can use 4? All it effectively means is demonstrated care. It's just care. Why do we call our program the Care Factor program? It's because of this factor, the care factor. I'll explain why we single that one out shortly, because all 3 are important. We do need to demonstrate all 3. For example, 2 out of 3, Meatloaf might think it's not bad, but it's not bad. It's not good enough here. In other words, I might demonstrate integrity. I might even demonstrate care for my people. But if I'm bloody hopeless at my job, I'm incompetent, well, obviously, I'm not going to create and sustain trust with my people. Now, conversely, I might be really, really good at my job, very competent, and demonstrate integrity. But if my team perceive that I really don't care about them, you can forget building trust. It's simply not going to happen. So all 3 are important. Why we focus on the care factor there, the benevolence factor, is because the research is really, really clear. And that is to overcome mistrust. And that's a little bit different. To overcome mistrust, it is a care factor that actually is way more significant in doing so. And look, frankly, that's the space that we work in the most, is overcoming mistrust. You cannot even hope to overcome mistrust if we don't demonstrate care for our people. And so that's the reason we focus on it. Now, we're not going to do this live. I'm just going to tell you what happened just to save a bit of time. But it might be interesting for you to do this with your own leadership team at some stage. And feel free to use this slide. I'm happy to forward these to you. But every leadership group I work with did one of these yesterday in in Victoria. It's a question I ask. I say, put your hand up if in general you believe leaders within your company do actually care about their teams. And look, frankly, most hands go up. Often, all hands go up. And in my experience, that does tend to be true. It may not be universal, but generally speaking, none of these leaders of teams want their people to be injured. They all want them to do well, all that stuff. So that is generally the case. So then I ask question 2, which is this. All right, do you believe, and in fact, put your hand up if you believe in general, leaders in your organization are really good at demonstrating care for their team? And it's always interesting to see what happens next, in that usually very few hands go up. There's usually a big discrepancy between hands going up in question 1 and question 2. And so we process that, of course, we have a talk about that. And look, what it tends to mean is it's not that leaders don't care. Most of them do. It's just they're not either not good at or not willing to or feel awkward in demonstrating care. Now, why is this important? Well, think about it. When I work at the crew level and I ask the crew, question one, do you believe that leaders care about their teams? Often not that many hands go up. And think about it. If we're not demonstrating care, how would they know? How would they know we do care if we don't demonstrate it? So to me, number one, it's a big waste because leaders actually do care, but they don't know it because we don't demonstrate it. So again, we often then discuss, well, what are examples of demonstrating care? And it's interesting when I talk to leaders and then I talk to crews. I did have one senior leader, actually, a GM recently. He said, well, of course we demonstrate care, Clive, he said in a fairly condescending tone. We pay them. That is true, we do pay them. And I guess you could see that as a demonstration of care, but the workforce won't see it that way. That's what we'd refer to perhaps as transactional care. That is different to what I believe is demonstrated care. Now, there are many ways that we can demonstrate care, but when I talk to the workforce and I say, what would be the most common example for you that tells you that your leader cares about you? Now, I don't know what's running through people's heads, but it's almost invariably the same answer. And that is, well, you know, I can tell they care because they actually listen to us. They listen. That's it. Now, of course, that does infer that leaders have been out there asking questions, humble inquiry, to get, you know, that input from the workforce. And of course, once they've got that input, they acknowledge it. So people know they've been listened to. Moreover, I might then come back and let them know how I'm progressing with what they've said and so forth. But actually getting out there or even inviting your crew in occasionally. And in my book, I actually have a chapter called the Stockdale Paradox, or inviting your crews to share bad news. And that is a really good technique that you can make this quite formalized in your team. And Amy Edmondson says the same thing. If you want to get really, really good at this, we need to structurally embed opportunities to bring the workforce in to share what is not going well and so forth. So demonstrating care is really, really important stuff. Now, I am aware of the time, doing okay, but I thought I'd just round this off. Just a few final thoughts just to summarize that. My hope is that even though I've talked a fair bit here, those 5 key statements, those 5 key ideas can sort of stick in your head. Maybe, again, they're useful things to remind ourselves of before we write a policy, before we do a safety walk. Oh, that's what I meant to say, by the way, before I get to these final thoughts. I've mentioned it a few times. This is a big one. I am recommending getting out there frequently, humble inquiry, and so forth. But what reminded me was this week, I was working with a company, and I'm sure this is true of many companies that you guys represent. They have a KPI around safety walks. Now, frankly, I'm not a huge fan of KPIs in safety anyway, but the KPI they had around safety walks was essentially that every leader has to do 8 safety walks a month, right? So effectively 2 a week. Now, I've got to tell you, very few of these leaders actually enjoy doing them. And there's good reasons for that too. So what they all tend to do is leave it to the end of the month, right? And what they do is they bang out 8 quick ones. So what do you get towards the end of the month? This swarm of leaders on site with the hard hats, with the high-vis vest, with the pen and the pad, looking for bad stuff. Now, this has become predictable. So there's a lovely Deming quote, where there's fear, you get bad information. And that's exactly what goes on here. The supervisors, the workers, they know they're coming. So the supervisors will say to the crews, guys, go and have a tidy up, eh? Just go and have a good tidy, make sure everything's shipshape. So they're not getting true data anyway. Excuse me. So that's happening. And they're all out, they're looking, what are they looking for? As I mentioned before, bad stuff, unsafe stuff. They'll write it down, they'll take a photograph of it, they won't tidy it up, They'll take a photograph of it. They might call people over. Hey, what are you doing here? What's this about? You know, this should be like this and this. Again, tell me just in that, what is happening to trust? What is happening to fear? And I said to this GM, and part of me, I guess, was being a little bit flippant, but I said, look, if you've got to have a KPI around this, I don't think you do, but if you believe you've got to have a KPI around this, how about this as a KPI? What percentage of my people's children's names do I know? And let's just say that was 80%. What would that also suggest that you've been doing? And of course, what it suggests I've been doing is just getting out there for a walk, not a safety walk, just a walk, and chatting with the guys about things even other than safety. Now, before you have a go at me, I know it wouldn't work in practice, right? Because you'd have some leaders going out there, right, what are your kids' names? Got it. What are your kids' names? Got it. Yeah, 90%. I know it wouldn't work in practice, but the spirit, I believe, of what I'm saying remains true. Instead of thinking in terms of a safety walk, which don't tend to work out that well, just go for a walk. By all means, while you're out there, humble inquiry, ask people what they need to do the job well. If you see something that you're concerned about, well, just be authentic about that. Right? And we teach the difference between owning your words and projecting blame, the difference between adult to adult communication and parent to child communication. Parent child would be you here. Why are you doing like that? That's wrong. Parent child. You end up leading a team of children effectively in a psychological sense. Adult means you own your words. And all I mean by this, can we just have a quick chat? When I look at this, I feel uncomfortable. And I'm not sure why. Can you help make sense of this for me? Why does it look like that? That's adult to adult communication. You can have those conversations without losing trust in the process. So again, we need to be careful with what we measure, what we have KPIs on. I'm, of course, not a fan of traditional lag indicators. I'm not a huge fan necessarily of lead indicators, unless they're going to be useful. For me, one of the only lead indicators I actually do use is the amount of workforce suggestions about safety that have been listened to and responded to per month. I reckon that's a good one. I reckon that's a pretty good lead indicator. Because again, what does it mean? We're actually asking the workforce for the solutions. We're letting them know we've heard them, and then we're going to action it whenever we can. That's a pretty good KPI. But generally speaking, not a big fan of KPIs and safety. What I suggest is measure what matters. We're always doing bloody culture surveys, aren't we? Staff engagement surveys and all that stuff. There's a wonderful cartoon on LinkedIn this morning. A boss holding up the results of the psychological safety survey, which looked very low. And then the next part of the cartoon is them screaming, "I demand to know why you think that," and so forth. Measure what matters. And to me, if you're going to measure anything, measure trust. Measure trust. It's the biggest predictor of safety performance, and it's the biggest predictor of a high-performing team. Why would you worry about too much else? That's just my thought anyway. I open to your questions at the end. All right, some final thoughts. Again, please don't assume our leaders know how to create trust or psychological safety. They may well not know, and that is not necessarily their fault at all. They may just not have been trained in that. Don't assume they know how to do this stuff. Just find that out and make changes. Just a reminder again, we can blame or we can learn, not both. Now, just to hark back on what we spoke about earlier, the fundamental assumptions we have as leaders about why incidents happen will either tend to focus us on people as the problem or the solution. And what we need to do is get a little bit more conscious about this. The assumptions that we make, they drive either of those self-fulfilling prophecies, either the trust loop or the fear loop. Now, again, it's human nature after some negative event to go straight to blame. It's what your energy-saving brain actually wants you to do. And that's why away from work, with our kids, with our partners, when a mistake happens or a bad event, that's why we want to go straight to blame, because it's quick and it's easy for our brain. Actually pulling back and actually operating from humble inquiry instead takes that little bit of time, that deep breath, that conscious intervention. And again, that's something that we can just get better at. Trust is key. I'm pretty sure that point's come across. Overall, less telling and more asking. I'm just going to check the time, Scott. Yeah, I'm doing it. Just one more point here. One of my biggest bugbears, I think, and this might be an Australian thing, I don't know, although I'm pretty sure it's not. Even in the high hazard, sophisticated global organizations, start of shift meetings, generally dreadful. And when I work with crews, and I've been asking this question now for 20 years, I will ask the workforce, give me one word that best describes a start of shift meeting or a toolbox talk. What do you reckon the most common word I get in response to that is? And feel free to type it in the chat window and might have a look at that later. The most common word the workforce give me when I ask, what do you think of pre-start meetings? Not sure if anybody's typed anything yet. I can't see that window. The word they give me is boring. Boring. And you think about how the brain works. Start of shift meetings are generally done at the same time, in the same place, by the same person, going through the same major themes day in, day out. And they might end with a lame question like, was yesterday a safe day? To which they just nod their heads. I've got to tell you, our lazy little subconscious brain sits through 2 or 3 of those. And forever then onwards, they're going to sit there on autopilot. Now, arguably the most important safety meeting of the day for the crews, and many of them, frankly, are just sitting there thinking about donuts or something else. Again, it doesn't have to be that way. And that's because we tend to do a lot of telling in pre-start meetings. And we need to do a bit of that, but we need to do less telling. The conscious brain is switched on by questions. In fact, your brain has no choice. There's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system. Whenever it hears a question, it is hardwired to look for an answer. In fact, you cannot not do this. Let me just chuck it out there quickly. Let me ask you all a question, in fact. But here's my instruction. When you hear this question, please do not answer it. Okay, this is a very easy thing. All right, please don't answer this question. What is 2 plus 2? And what just happened in your heads? I'm pretty sure you became conscious of the answer. And a group of this caliber, I'm pretty sure that was 4. In other words, you have to answer it. So what we do when we're telling is sort of tune people out by asking questions, especially really effective questions. And there's a whole couple of chapters in the book on that. We make it much more likely that people will engage and switch their brains on. So that's just that little thought there. Yeah, get out there. You don't have to call it a safety walk, but get out there. Humble inquiry. What do you need to do your job well and safely? Yeah, transactional care is not enough. All right, paying people, not enough. Giving them PPE, not enough. You've got to demonstrate it. And the best way, or one of the best ways to do that is by actually listening to your crew. And more importantly, letting them know that they have been heard. It would be a really big one. As I've touched on here, there's a chapter in the book on this. After an incident, if I want to know about a culture of an organization, the best indicator for me is usually how they respond after an incident. And Sidney Dekker, again, has written widely about this. The more mature climates, they will take a restorative approach, making sure the victims are cared for, asking the questions, why did it make sense to do this? Learning from it, as opposed to the retribution approach, looking for people to blame, discipline, harsh and all that sort of stuff. So that would be a big one too. So just finally, most of the material I've been talking about there is drawn from the book that's on screen there right now. I think from what I've seen on LinkedIn, many of you have actually got a copy. If you haven't, it's the cheapest and quickest on Amazon. I actually buy them from Amazon myself. I actually do get a discount from the publisher who put a crazy price on it on their website. Even with my author discount from the publisher, it's still cheaper for me to buy it off Amazon. Work that out, because I can't. But anyway, Amazon's probably the best place. So, all right, I shall come out of this. Oh, by the way, if you're on LinkedIn, again, please feel free to connect with me or our organization or the Care Factor community. Happy to chat on there anytime. What I'm going to do, Scott, is come out of this. How did I go for time? Pretty well, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Clive. Very enlightening talk. I think it resonated with most of us. Certainly a lot of comments, but not very many questions
Excellent.
for you. Louise says that many of the leaders and board members have become successful by being autocratic. And I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Some of the leaders I've met, you know, it is very much you do what I tell you to do, not what you think you should do. Interesting one from, I think it was Francis, on the values that you're putting forward are very much similar to the Christian faith.
Okay.
Which, yeah, I think that rings a bell as well. I mean, Christian faith is all about care. In fact, many religions are like that. I was particularly interested in your approach to KPIs. I felt very much the same, because every time I would go and see the directors and the chair, it was right. What are our accident stats like? And you just go, well, hang on a bit. That's telling you what's happened. You know,
that's right. That's past.
It's not really helping to point us in the right direction. The other thing that you touched on was that we like to make things easy. Our brains are wired to take the easy option. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about basically Daniel Kahneman's approach, thinking fast and slow, and the fact that probably in safety, what we tend to do is make it hard for people.
Yeah, we do. That's a brilliant point, Clive. So, if I may, just a couple of things you've said there. One on the KPIs, and the other one on Thinking Fast and Slow, which is another book I thoroughly recommend, by the way. It's just a brilliant book. Type 1 and Type 2 thinking, which I'll come back to very shortly. Just on the KPIs, it's still commonplace in Australia, for example, to give a cash bonus for X amount of time LTI free. So the KPI is, if we go, I don't know, 90 days LTI free, there's sometimes a sizable cash bonus. And this frustrates me so much, because what that does is literally incentivize non-reporting. You're just wrecking your culture, you're wrecking your reporting culture. And again, that's just one example of where KPIs just really get in the way of safety. Measure what matters, and stop complicating it. Now, just on that last point, Thinking Fast and Slow, thoroughly recommend that. It's got so many links to safety. So for those of you that haven't read the book, Type 1 and Type 2 thinking. Type 1 thinking is, if you like, unconscious. It's that fast, rapid, your lazy brain's responding. So it's quick, it's almost effortless. It's just your immediate reaction. Type 2 thinking is hard, it's laborious, it's that conscious mind really focusing. And what is your brain's preference? Well, your brain's preference, of course, is to save energy. And whenever your brain has the opportunity, without your conscious intent, it will tend to go for that. And this is a really good point to make about the concept of safety clutter. And again, for those of you familiar with David Proven's work, he's done a lot on this. It's a really important point. What we're great at is adding to safety policies and procedures, right? For example, if there's a near miss, if there's an actual incident, almost guaranteed output from that is a renewed policy or a whole bunch of new policies and procedures. And we just keep adding to the pile. We're very good at that. What we're not good at is taking them away. We hardly ever do that. And I think part of the reason we don't take them away is probably fear-based. Well, what if we take it away and then there's an incident and the regulator needs it, or the government, and so forth? So neurotically, we hang on to everything. And I've got to tell you, if I was to put, say, all of BHP's safety policies and procedures into one document, you would probably need a forklift to drive it around. And then you think, well, hang on, we've got a lazy brain. If I've got to read through a JHA or a JSA that's this big, you reckon most people are going to do that? Really? They're going to go to their instinctive, I've done this before, I know what's going on. And so we've got to be very, very mindful of how much information we provide people with. It's a great point, Clive.
Is Clive there?
Yeah.
Oh, has he gone?
Yep.
No?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Still there, Clive? Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions direct for Clive now?
There is another statement, really. Mark Harley has a question in their statement. Mentioned Australia is leading the way in discussing psychological safety, and I concur. How do you feel about debates that we see on LinkedIn around safety 1 and 2? And I've seen a lot of those.
Yeah.
Or New View,
Yeah.
or traditional.
Yeah.
The Don Cooper versus Sidney Dekker. I see value in listening to both concepts, by the way. But yes, you're either in one camp or the other, you know. And well,
yeah.
on LinkedIn. Yeah.
It's a great question, and it's something I've been talking a little bit myself about on LinkedIn, because part of me is getting a little bit frustrated by this. I think tend to get lumped in with the New View guys or the Safety Differently guys, and that's probably my own fault. I did write about Safety Differently. Well, the final chapter I talk about Safety Differently, but I in the book I don't mention HOP, I don't mention Safety 2 or any of the others, and there's a good reason for that. And if I can quickly explain it this way, and it goes back to my clinical training, just like safety, in clinical psychology, we have this whole menu of different psychological methodologies we can use, right? Way back to Freud, to behavior therapy, which people used in the 50s. But again, there's cognitive therapy, there's Gestalt therapy, there's EMDR, there's all these huge, and a very smart lecturer. This is when I was doing my final year in clinician and clinical psych. The assignment was to go away, look through all the different models, and then pick which one lends itself to you. Pick your favorite, essentially. And so we came back to class and he said, right, I want you to discuss your favorite model with your classmates. And it was fascinating. Within 4 or 5 minutes, heated arguments about this is the favorite model, this is the best model, this is the best model. And it was getting quite irate, a little bit like LinkedIn, right, with safety. And then the very sage lecturer said, right, stop. He said, let's have a look at, again, measure what matters, right? He said, let's look at the predictive power here. He said, the model that you use in therapy is way down the list in terms of what predicts successful outcomes, to the point of insignificance. You just pick the one that's you like. Right at the top of the list in terms of what predicts positive outcomes is what we call the therapeutic alliance. And that is essentially the trust between us and the client, the trust. It doesn't matter what model you use. If you don't have that therapeutic alliance, it's not going to make the slightest bit of difference what model you use. I think it's the same in safety. Look at it now, all right? Under the New View banner alone, what have you got? Resilience engineering, Safety 2, Safety Differently, HOP, and so forth. And it's the same thing, right? Know the models, because there's interesting stuff in all of the models. Absolutely there is. Know them, because you'll pick something up from all of them, just like we did in clinical psych. But I've got to tell you, at the end of the day, if you have not first built that alliance, it doesn't matter what model you use. It's not going to make the slightest bit of difference. So by all means, have a look into the models. I've got my favorites for sure, but that's just because they fit with who I am. I'm, for example, not a fan of behavior-based safety for the reasons I've presented below. I don't think it lends itself that well to creating trust, but I know there are people out there who use behaviorism in different ways that can build that alliance, and that's absolutely fine. It just doesn't appeal to me. of the new view aspects, I tend to favor safety differently. Safety 2 to me is much more about systems. Safety differently to me is more about people. And it's about bringing our people in. Again, people are the solution. And so that lends itself to me. It is not about the model. It is about the alliance. And that's about trust, if that makes sense.
Okay, we have another question that's come in, Clive. If you're still able to stay awake.
Yeah, the coffee's serving me well, you bet.
Or is it time for breakfast now?
It will be shortly.
Yeah. Okay. Faye says, I work for a large corporate organization who are very committed to old views and frustrating programs like Choose Zero. What's the best way to start and change their approach?
So I'm very sorry there, Clive. You just cracked up a little bit towards the end of that question. Could you just give me that again? Yep.
Yeah. Faye works for a large corporate organization who's very committed to the old views and frustrating programs like Choose Zero. What's the best way to start and change the approach? Yeah,
great question. And can I just say, those of you that have read my book would know that I'm not a big fan of zero harm as a goal, right? Or zero incidents or zero. And I do lay out my case for that in the book. But for me, again, I'd still say probably 50% still of my clients have some form of zero goal. One recently I saw on their shirts, it was beyond zero. I mean, what are you going to do? Reincarnate people now? But anyway, the reason I'm not a fan of zero is because I'm evidence-based, purely. And so there is not, just know this, there is not a single shred of evidence that having a goal of zero harm does any good. Not a shred. There is quite robust evidence, including from the UK construction industry, that having a goal of zero makes it more likely that you will have a life-changing incident or fatality. More likely. Now that sounds counterintuitive, right? A goal of zero makes good philosophical sense. I don't want anybody in my team to be injured, of course I don't. But that binary language, zero or not zero, what often ends up happening psychologically is companies become, even if it's not intended, they become intolerant of incidents. And when we become intolerant of incidents, just quietly, what happens is we give the message that we don't want to hear about them. And so reporting generally goes underground. Now that is well understood. So for me, it is about how to make that changes is to present companies, senior executives with the research. They're holding on to something here that it's a looking good index. Hey, it's an LGI, a looking good index. And to be fair, a lot of contractors believe they've got to have a goal of zero because the client organization has a goal of zero. And if they don't match that, they might fear that they don't get work. So we're etching away at this. There is a movement now away from zero because of the research. But I think the only thing we can do at this stage is just let our executives know there is no business case for this really, apart from worried about if we'll get work with a client. The research is very clear about this. Having a goal of zero does no good, but it does, or potentially can, do harm. Give them the research around that. I think that's the best chance we've got, is just to change their mind there. I did put a post on LinkedIn a while ago, presenting the research. And it was one of those horrible polls you get on LinkedIn. I swear to God, it's the only poll I'm going to do, right? But it was, if the research continues to demonstrate that a goal of zero is actually correlated with increased incidents, would you still keep the goal of zero? And I've got to tell you, about 40% of people who responded said yes, they would. Now that beggars belief in my view. What that is ideology, if you like, over research. And there's too much of that in the world as far as I'm concerned. Again, I'm evidence-based. So my only thought there would be, I'm happy to stand in front of them. I reckon I'm pretty good at making the case, and that's where I've been sort of making a few inroads. But it is just literally putting the research in front of them and then getting them to say, why would you stick with it? And I'm pretty sure that's a good question to put to them. Once you've given them the research, what is your rationale for sticking with it? There's kind of nowhere to go.
Thank you, Clive. Right, we've got another one from Terence. There's no real way of reducing harm when phrases like "so far as reasonably practicable" is used. What's your definition of reasonably practicable?
Oh God, I'm not sure my opinion would be any more valid than anybody else's. As reasonably practicable. Oh, look, what it's going to mean is, have we done, this is, I think, the meaning most people would have we done everything that we can reasonably do to prevent harm? I think that's what it means. I mean, you know, you could ideally spend $1 billion and just create robots for every single job. Great, sorted safety out, huh? That is not reasonably practicable. So that's what it's saying. And so I get what they're saying, but man, I hate that sort of language. Again, I don't believe in the whole thing of zero. I would like to see zero. I don't believe in that as a fundamental goal. This is just me being rational after doing this for 20 years. We're going to have incidents. Let's do everything we can to minimize them, but we're going to have them. But let's do what works. Let's get rid of some of the jargon behind it. Let's get rid of some of the KPIs and goals and values. Here's another one, golden rules. Most companies have golden rules. Hey, I wish they were beige, not golden, because again, the trouble with golden rules is they're so inflexible. And if there's a breach, and maybe there was a very good reason for that breach, you fire that person. And again, what do you end up with is nobody's going to report the next time they breach a golden rule. And so there's so much jargon and formalized stuff in this. Yeah, so that's what I understand the reasonably practicable to mean. And I get why they say it. I get what they're saying. Have we done everything reasonable? I guess there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, actually. But it's flexible, isn't it? People can argue what is reasonably practicable. It's elastic.
Yeah, I mean, it is legal terminology, but I think you summed it up by saying you do what works.
Yeah.
You know, if you can do what works, then yeah, it might cost a little bit more sometimes than others, but it actually achieves the goal, which is to have a low incident rate. You know. Sure. Okay, I think we should probably wrap things up there, Clive. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, we've gone 4 minutes over. Well done, everyone. Appreciate you hanging on there.
So we've just got a few bits and pieces to pass on to the membership. So if I can ask Scott to share his screen.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, what you've talked about, Clive, is firmly based in the behavioural side of our competency framework, but some of it is going to go across into the core, particularly leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for everybody who is looking to progress with IOSH, this is our competence framework, which we will be referring to every presentation that we have, just to point people in direction of where they've learned some competency. Next slide, please, Scott. Okay, there is a feedback survey link if you would like to comment on the presentation this evening, and we will publish the results in due course. Next slide, please. And there's also these QR codes that you can use for the web page linked in to, and we'd also ask if you'd like to become a mentor, or if you have any mentoring requirements. Okay. Right. The next speaker is Andrew Litchfield, and it's our usual annual legal update. So if you want to tune in for that, then please go to the IOSH website and register your interest. And just a few summations there. So thank you for attending. We hope you've enjoyed yourself. And if you have any questions, please get in touch with the committee, and we will endeavour to answer the questions for you. So thank you, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
And for Clive, good morning.
Yeah, thank you.